We're going to talk a little bit tonight about how Jewish values can help us to grow as well in a different way, particularly in times that are challenging. And, you know, we say they're unprecedented, but certainly within Jewish tradition, there are lots of times that have been unprecedented in their time. So I'm going to turn this over to Maurice and show the next slide. Can you all see the slides here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Haven't seen the next one yet.
That's because, oh, that's weird. Okay, here we go. There you go.
Very good. Very good. Very good. So, you know, one of the new words that I've learned is VUCA. And I'm not sure if anyone else has heard that term before, but I hear it all over. And I think the first time I read it was in the Jerusalem Report. There's a regular column there by Shlomo Maital, who's at the Technion. And he always has interesting stuff that he writes about. And he was writing about, in the context of COVID, that this term VUCA is used in the Israeli War College to talk about a certain kind of environment. And as you can see on the screen, it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And those are the things that I think many of us have been experiencing during the pandemic. And as we take a step back and just think about the times we're in now, these feelings are often with us. And it is important to note that while the term seems to have been coined by Dennis and Nanis in 1985, it's clearly not new, right? And throughout Jewish history, the Jewish people have often had to function in times of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we've managed to do that. And so today we think we're going to explore a little bit about, so what are the unique things that are facing us in our families and our workplaces as a result of these conditions? Jeff, next one. There we go. So there's a lot of research that's been done on this, and I think you can add in the chat box your own reflections of what being in this kind of environment does to you. But the main things that have come up is that our emotions are heightened. And we are maybe quicker to get angry. We are maybe quicker to get worried. We feel a higher degree of stress. And this is important because the stress that we feel is a cumulative stress. So it's not even where we're necessarily having a bad day today, but it's all those bad days we've been having that get to us. That there's a lot of feeling of loss and anxiety. And I think if we reflect on it, and as I reflect on myself, you're worried. You're worried that you're going to get something. And you're also worried about the people who got something. And so this is a constant thing on your mind. And this invariably leads to strained relationships. I think, again, for many of us, we have spent an inordinate amount of time with a small group of people. Allegedly, we love these people, but over time, that begins to become a question mark. It's just natural for relationships to be strained. And when our relationships are strained, our creativity gets taxed. And, you know, we might say, well, what does creativity have to do with it? Well, creativity is the way we keep avoiding the same mistakes over and over and over again. And so when we're in this VUCA environment, and you think we'd be so motivated to do something different, to just change things up, we keep finding ourselves going back to the same patterns over and over again. And that, of course, exacerbates everything. And then we're in a wider time when polarization is up and listening is down. And, you know, I see at, you know, at Rutgers with my students, it takes work to get people to actually listen to each other. It's almost as if we're just interested in hearing ourselves speak and not necessarily so interested in what other people in our families and our circle have to say. So this provides a certain kind of environment for our parenting, for our grandparenting. And even if we may not be consciously aware of it, these are pretty pervasive occurrences. And so, again, not unfamiliar in the Jewish context. So we want to explore a little bit about what are some of the implications of this environment for how we deal with our kids and our grandkids and our loved ones. Jeff?
So to move us to the next phase, what I'm going to do is introduce, talking to people who are going to be familiar with this, so I won't spend a lot of time on introduction, but we're going to draw from Jewish wisdom to connect to some of the responses to VUCA environments. Perhaps we should call this co-VUCA instead of COVID, because we're in the COVID VUCA environment. And there are plenty of sources for where to look for Jewish wisdom. And Maurice and I decided that we'd go with the tradition of Musar and Midot, which itself emerged in a VUCA-ish environment in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. It was a time of polarization where the Jewish community was having arguments among brothers and siblings, as one sees in the Jewish community, even to this day. And at that point, there was a strand of Judaism that was really doubling down on study and was criticized as being very narrow. There was a strand of Judaism that was very into the spiritual and the celebratory and was criticized as not being grounded enough. And into this conversation came the study of Musar. Musar is from the word for tradition or to pass on a tradition. Masorati is from the same, or traditional is from the same root. And it's really a system for accounting and enhancing traits or measures. A midah means, the word midah means a measure of something. And the idea is that there are various character traits or virtues or values that we could not quantify in a scientific way, but rather reflect on and look at how we're doing with some of these character traits. So how am I doing with humility, for example? And the thing about these measures, the reason it's not just, well, you should have more. It's not that you should have more, you should have the right measure. Because you can have too much or too little of any of these things. You could have too much humility. There are times where humility is not called for. You could have too little humility. And the idea of Musar is to take these midot, which involved some studying about the sources related to these midot and the nuances of the midot, and applying them to everyday life through a reflective practice. And I included one fun fact, which is that something we know thanks to research by, among other people, Nancy Sinkoff of our very own Rutgers University. One of the prolific writers and definitive writers about Musar in the 19th century, a fellow named Leffin, and he wrote a book called Cheshbon HaNefesh. And in that book, he draws very conscious, like, you know, right out there from Benjamin Franklin's 13 Virtues. And he offers his own 13 virtues, which are more or less the Hebrew translation of Benjamin Franklin's. And it's very interesting to see sort of a cross-fertilization and, as Maurice discussed, a creativity in response to the tensions in the Jewish community. So we're not going to talk about the Benjamin Franklin's virtues, but I want to show you a different, if I could get it going. Here are some other virtues. Now, these virtues are taken from a book called Everyday Holiness by Alan Morinis. And if you're not familiar with this book, I recommend it. It's a very accessible, but deeply written book about applying Musar to your own lives and to our own experience. These are the chapter headings. And what we're going to do is, in just a minute, Jerry's going to break us up into groups. And you're going to think with your group about this question. Which midot do you see as particularly applicable to these kovuka times, the COVID VUCA times, and how so? So you don't have to decide on your groups. You don't have to come to consensus, but we'll report back about what some of the thoughts were about some of the places where your ideas overlapped and what some of the discussion was. Just check in with each of the rooms to see if people had some thoughts that they wanted to share. And then let's throw the conversation open and we could discuss as a larger group, which of these do you feel are most applicable to our time? So let me just check first with room one, Rabbi Malamit, Joanne Stahl, and Steve.
Make sure you unmute when you talk.
So we had some votes for patience, equanimity, humility. I forget what Barbara said, loving kindness or something.
I said that, yes. What did you say?
Compassion.
Compassion.
Passion.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it seems like you need all the above, but. Oh, and
it is hard to narrow them down. And there is a fundamental belief of Musars that all of these are really interrelated, that by working on any one of these, you're going to eventually circle back to all of them, that we isolate them in sort of an artificial way, but ultimately they are all connected. So room two, which might just have been Michael and Marcia.
So I'd make a case for enthusiasm in that list. So this is my experience as an educator over the last year and a half. First of all, you as an educator have to bring so much more of an energy level, in the hope that that will be contagious. Contagious in the good sense of the word, the one good sense of the word. And that the students will pick up on it, and that they too will find that energy and enthusiasm to bring, because quite frankly, everything else is pushing back against it. So you have to make a special effort for it.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about a little patience on both sides, as teachers and as students, compassion. I say gratitude at the end. I just felt like there were many times where I just had to be thankful for what I had, for the fact that we weren't sick, the kids were still in school and still getting the education they need, albeit not necessarily in the way that they needed it. And gratitude now that the boys are on campus at Rutgers and will have more classes in person next semester than they had this semester. And but a lot of compassion for them, that they weren't getting the high school and college experiences that they grew up expecting.
Great, thanks. How about room three? Raquel, Marla, Susan, and Wendy. Someone want to jump in?
We talked about patience, the need for it, the ever-growing strain on it. This past weekend's news really straining it, and the need to be patient with different people in your family and where they are in this run. Wendy brought up a really good idea. I don't know if I can say it. Wendy, can you say what you said about the fight or flight? That was great.
Oh, I was starting to mention the very unnatural place that we're in. So loving kindness was what I was focusing on, because we're in such an unnatural state of prolonged, to the nth degree, of fight or flight. You know, the initial reaction to any kind of trauma or crisis is that fight or flight, and that usually is short-lived, and then you move on from there, hopefully. And this has just been ongoing, and that's unfathomable. And so I think just having to take that into account in understanding where we all are with that in varying places of how we're dealing with that, to whatever extent that is. And, you know, the idea that loving kindness is needed more than ever.
Good way to put it.
Thank you.
Also brought up gratitude in our group. There was a piece about gratitude that, as somebody else said, we're grateful that we have what we have today. Food, roof, you know, that kind of thing. Our life isn't being taken away. Health, those of us who have gotten through this fine.
And now that you could actually see the chat, are there any others that you might add to the list that are on the chat list? Could you still not see the chat?
No, I don't see it.
Really?
No, I don't have it.
That's weird.
See a
All right.
chat. Can't see the list of me note.
See
There's
it
a
in the
list of
group, and
you
I
guys,
can't
but
find it now either.
That's
You
all right.
you could put the slide up.
Yeah, I'll put this. That's a good idea. Let's do that.
It went to everyone. I don't know why it can't be seen by everyone.
Yeah, let's see. There. There. So taking a look at this, anything you might add to your list?
I don't know if
I'm
people,
going to throw one in, which is equanimity, composure, and calmness. Because I really related to the comment that Maurice made at the very beginning, that the amount of time from stressor to reaction is reducing, and you know, you see it all the time with the videos of people who just react and blow up because of, you know, some slight that's happened. And sometimes I feel that way, and you know, I'm riding the subway, and if I see someone without a mask, you know, I have to figure out how not to be reactive. And I think that for a lot of people, equanimity is something that's in short supply these days for COVID, and also for other reasons in our society.
I don't know if anybody has mentioned compassion, but I think sort of that goes along somewhat with the loving kindness that I think Wendy may have mentioned, or somebody else mentioned. Is it's sort of realizing the situation that we're all in this situation, and you just have to be gentle with, try to be gentle with people, and it ties into a bunch of the others too.
Yeah, can you go back to the slide before for a second? Yeah, so I just wanted to share that the chart here for temperance, obviously they're meant to be days of the week, and the dots are meant to be times when people violate a particular virtue. And so, first of all, it's interesting because, you know, we always like to be very strength oriented, and we always like to praise the positive. But in the teaching of Midot and the accounting, the emphasis was on the negative. And in part because the idea was that it's our failures that are going to probably be more salient to us, and they'll be easier to count than our successes. Plus, sometimes we could count marginal things as our successes. But underlying all this, which I think is something to think about, is the power of habit, and the idea of repeating these positive actions, even if you don't feel them, was believed by Levin and I think even by Benjamin Franklin to eventually get you thinking in the right way. And you know, Rabbi Malin, maybe you can comment on this, but one of the things that was written about in the rabbinic introduction to Cheshbon HaNefesh is that in the accounting system of Jewish values, evil thoughts count less than evil actions. And so the key emphasis really was on having the positive actions, even if you didn't really fully believe it. Even if you really weren't feeling compassionate at the moment, showing your child compassion will have benefits and will accrue benefits. And so the whole idea of this is to make sure that we're systematic and rigorous in our accounting, because without that discipline, without that sort of self-conscious determination to follow these 13 virtues, it's easy for us to be overwhelmed by events. And one of the reasons for that is the underlying influence of Yetzer Hara, of the evil impulse. And it's presumed in these things to always be operating if we let it. And again, I think that's another reason why there was such an emphasis on accounting, tracking, self-reflection, and being disciplined enough to act on these midot, even when you don't feel like it, because it's the right thing to do. And then, of course, over time, you will start to feel like it more easily because you do it. So I'm curious as to folks' reflections on that.
Sounds like where Alcoholics Anonymous got their program. And I've never been, from what I hear.
When I look at that list, responsibility jumps out at me, not so much that some of us need more responsibility, but our children, teenagers and others, are seeing all these adults who are not being responsible in terms of masking, social distancing, willing to do immunizations and saying they don't need them. And I'm wondering what message our kids are getting about responsibility for one another. So even if you don't think you need to mask for yourself to be responsible for the next person, you need to mask for their benefit.
Right.
I was thinking about something just a little bit different, going back to the keeping score and the keeping score of the negatives, the transgressions, as it were. So I wonder whether some of that may come from a sense that the people around you don't keep track of the things you're doing right, that it's more obvious when you do things wrong, and people feel affected by that. I mean, I can go through a week of saying nice things to somebody, and if I snap at them once, that's what's going to be remembered from the week. So you keep track of those times.
Okay.
And you know that leads to an important observation that I don't think is on the list on the next of the list of midot, and that is apology. That is one of the most important tools we have in working with our partners, our children, our grandchildren, because the stresses and tensions are inevitable. And no one can maintain that kind of standard of never snapping, never saying the wrong thing. But apology goes a very, very long way. I mean, I personally I grew up in a household where my parents did not believe in apology. They did not believe they were ever wrong. And when I once asked them if they wanted to rethink the fact that they might have never been wrong, they told me I was wrong to even question that about them. So apology wasn't a big thing in my household, but in reality, apology is an extraordinarily powerful technique of stress reduction and guilt reduction in our kids. Because a lot of times our kids think that when we snap, that they're the cause. And even though, you know, we from our context know it has nothing to do with them, but our kids will often make that attribution. And that's why I think in these particular times, for the reasons that Jerry outlined, because none of us will be anything close to perfect, we have to be very quick to settle things and be unafraid and unhesitant to let kids know that we lost it.
May I ask a question just in terms of maybe one thing that's not on the list, which is, or I don't recall, it's humor. And while humor may be related to compassion and truth, there's something to be said for humor as a kind of safety valve to release to detoxify and de-escalate situations. But I've noticed that it's very hard to be funny now, whether it's on the pulpit or I have certain things that I gravitate towards in watching, but it's very hard to be funny and in a way that is just satisfying. And yet humor is such an important part of life and relationships, and such an important part of just, releasing pent up tensions with each other. So I don't know if it's a midah though.
Yeah.
I see it as potentially related to humility, in that we don't always take ourselves so seriously, and that's an important message to give too.
You don't see a lot of discussion of humor in Cheshbon HaNefesh, and I don't think Ben Franklin was big on that either.
And yet he was an incredibly funny guy. He was full of humor and love of life, you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we sort of separate that out. And I have a colleague who is a member of the American Association for Therapeutic Humor. Okay. Anybody else here a member of that? just me? Oh, right. Yeah, well, so they did an interesting study, and I'm going to replicate that study with folks. So the question is, and you can put your answers in the chat box, how many times a day does the average preschool child laugh from the time they get up in the morning until the time they go to sleep at night? If you just leave them to their own devices, about how many times a day does the average preschool child laugh? Put a number in the chat box based on what you think. How many times? 40, 30, 30, 40. We got to get you around more preschoolers. Who said 500? Jerry. Jerry's the closest. It's about 300 times. Now the question is, how many times a day does the average adult laugh?
Well, +1 there.
3, right? It's about, yeah, it's closer to 12. So the thing we have to ask ourselves is what happens to the laughs? And I think what happens is that it gets squeezed out of us because we get too serious and we make too big a deal about everything that we do. And so laughter, in school, humor is seen as like frivolity. It's like time off task. It's time away from learning. It's very rarely seen as an adjunct to learning, which in fact it really is. And so one of the reasons why humor is a casualty in VUCA is because of creativity being a casualty. And without creativity, you don't really have the same sense of humor. And that also leads people to not receive your humor in the same way because they're not looking at it in a creative way. Humor is always that two-way connection, right? The sender and the receiver both have to perceive it to be funny. And when either one is not in a creative frame of mind, then that can very easily go awry. So that's an important addition, I think, in modern sensitivities, humor.
It's a complicated thing in terms of midot, though, because so much of contemporary humor is very mean-spirited. So it's so easy to cross over that line.
Right. Well, I think that's kind of what Jeff was implying before when he's saying the interrelationship of these things. That humor in the absence of respect or moderation can be damaging. Absolutely true. So we've got one more thing that we wanted to share with you. So let's go to that. Okay. So this is just a little bit of a summary of how we take the things that we talked about and translate them into practices that will mitigate the effect of VUCA. So number one is to be reassuring to our kids. Our kids do not need to be fully aware of every possible variant and its possible negative effects. All that will come out in due time. What they need to have is reassurance so they can walk around in a better state of mind for learning and relating to others. We have to be very patient with our kids. We have to be understanding, give the benefit of the doubt. This is very important during these times. And this is an interesting, subtle but important thing, and that is to set goals. That in this time of uncertainty, when we talk to our kids about things that are going to happen next year or things that are going to happen in a few months, it is incredibly reassuring to them. And they don't really necessarily care whether our plans have to be changed. That the act of us saying that something positive is going to happen in the future is implicitly incredibly reassuring to kids. So it is helpful to put those anchors in there, relating to family. It could be relating to a vacation. It could be relating to things that they're going to do. Obviously, when we're talking about bar bat mitzvah planning, there's a lot of things that we need to be approaching in an optimistic manner. Forgiveness is important, especially sibling forgiveness of one another, because siblings are going to be likely to get into more difficulty. And we have to both preach and practice a greater degree of forgiveness for minor transgressions that might be getting on our nerves. We got to take a step back and not think that by being a little more forgiving, we're going to be setting our kids on a path to destruction. Our kids need us to be a little more forgiving now. Being stupid. Asking ourselves the question of what is on the mind of the person who's with us. Where are they coming from? That's probably one of the things that we need to keep very front of mind with our kids. Where are they coming from? What have they just been experiencing? Who they've been talking to, playing with, etc., that might have led to that comment or led to that action. We have to be willing to see things from our kids' eyes, which is not an easy thing to do when we ourselves are under stress. Let me skip down to the need to de-stress. I never used to be a devotee of mindfulness, but the research on mindfulness is so convincing that we are, recommending that literally every school in New Jersey engage in a mindful moment at the start of the school day on the part of all kids and staff. And just literally 2 minutes of self-calming or breathing reduces stress levels. So if you think about our stress levels as constantly ramping up because of what's happening, if we don't do anything to bring them down, you could see where they get to the breaking point. And so making time in your house for mindful moments, maybe one in the morning, maybe one around dinner time, one around bedtime. These things really do help keep stress at more manageable levels, which then leads to fewer outbursts and all kinds of other things. And also opportunities to reflect. Again, in schools, a lot of schools are having kids keep reflection journals, gratitude journals. Kids are being asked to reflect on their feelings when they start the school day as a way of helping them get those emotions out. Having your kids being able to take a minute to reflect in writing or drawing or some other expressive way on their emotions of the day and after they've been in school will make it a little more likely that you'll have a peaceful time with them at home for the rest of the day. So opportunities to reflect, very powerful. And more conversations about getting the kids' views on family routines, homework, bedtime, morning routines. Again, so many things are shaken up in these times, and we need our kids to feel like their input matters and that their perspective on how things can go better is something that we will listen to and take seriously. It's not going to be any one big thing that's going to create a home run here. But it's a combination of these small things that we introduce into our routines that literally give parental and grandparental action to the various midot that we want to encourage. So open to reflections, examples that you like to share about effective strategies during these difficult times.
And any questions that you have, we could throw this open to Q&A as well.
Do you want to go off the share? Yeah.
So let me ask. I'm curious to know what the role of physical activity, music, and what you're presenting here. It sounds very religious. It sounds like religion at its best touches all of those boxes, checks all those boxes. Thinking also, the great outlets that are available to us, even under these circumstances, which include things like the study of Torah, things like music, things like prayer, which activate all of those things almost simultaneously. And while of course, in a non-religious environment, it's very hard to kind of put that in a frame around it. I'm wondering whether or not religion across the board, and not specifically Judaism, if religions are doing okay under the circumstances, and anecdotally, if you could kind of talk to that.
I think there's a significant body of research going back for a long time about religiosity as a protective factor during times of stress, and how that acts in a couple of ways. One is it establishes the habits that are consistent with some of the midot that were listed before, and those get woven into the fabric of religious observance. And the other is that religion tends to connect you with a caring community, and that when you have that caring community, that serves as a resource. It serves as just, at a very basic level, some people who check in on you and care about you and help you if there's a challenge.
I think the downside is that sometimes people think of midot as character traits. And then these traits are often thought to be immutable. That this represents a certain kind of child. And that's problematic from modern sensibilities, because we like to think that people can change. And so I think that, sometimes the religious sensibility can bring with it a little bit too much thought about the indwelling Yetzir Hara, and not enough thought to, well, what can we do for this particular child to help create the kind of environment, climate where this child can learn and grow.
I do also want to mention one of the midot that wasn't mentioned up to this point. It was at the very end. It was yirah, which is translated as awe, but it's very hard to translate. But sort of the amazement, the sort of radical amazement that Heschel and others talked about. And I think in these days where we get kind of bogged down in the everyday, because the everyday is a lot harder than it was a couple of years ago. So what are those moments? And religion could be a provider of this. And Rabbi Malma, you mentioned physical activity and being in the outdoors. Also, opportunities to sort of get beyond the immediate kind of the narrow place that we find ourselves in, and to be able to look more expansively at the bigger picture. And to me, that's encapsulated in yirah, or this idea of awe.
Fascinating.
So the one question in the chat box, and I know we're coming up to the end of our time, but I just want to address it because I think it's so important. What do you think is the impact to children of hearing adults watch or discuss the news and the tenor of those discussions lately? And I think it's pretty clear. We know the answer to that. It doesn't do the kids any good. But the larger issue, or not the larger issue, but the more proximal issue, is how much anxiety adults transmit to their kids. The studies that have been done recently have shown that it's not the kids who are having a hard time getting back to school. It's the adults that are having a hard time getting back to school. And then also getting the kids chattered about getting back to school. So yeah, the kids have not been in school, and they'll get used to being back in school, and they'll be fine in a few weeks. And they're not feeling like they have to be back fully in school in some incredible way within a week. And if that doesn't happen, that it implies some horrible loss. So I think adults do bear a good deal of responsibility for knowing the kids are around and are listening and watching, and they will pick up on things, and have been picking up on things in ways that are not helpful.
Maurice, if I can, from a different area. So my cousin Baruch, and this is for Rabbi Malmet, Pesach's son, his oldest son, Baruch. is a pediatric emergency physician in Boston. And his area is the reduction of anxiety and pain in children in the ER. And in many cases, step number one is moving the parent out of the room.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
Other comments from our speakers this was a very nice group. Patel, you have to unmute.
I have a question that's not really related to social emotional, but a friend of mine in Florida said to me, maybe I was telling her that I was going to this program, so it was good. She said, maybe you can find some insight on how we can convince my middle grandson, who's I guess approaching 20 already, to get the vaccine. Everybody else has been vaccinated in the family, and his father is compromised. How do you convince somebody? So I know this wasn't exactly the topic, but I have you here, so maybe you can give me some insight to pass on to her, because she says the family is hysterical about it. They're ready to kill him.
Well, I'm sure that helps a lot.
That would be
Sure it
effective.
does.
Yeah.
That would eliminate the problem.
Right.
It certainly would.
Right. You know what the hardest thing in all this, and this is the polarization issue. It keeps us from taking the person's perspective and really understanding what the reason is that they don't want to get vaccinated, and then think about who or what is the most important and powerful influence on this person. And I think unless we have answers to those two questions, we will be ineffective in pushing anything. Because those two things are really critical. We've got to really know what is it that is at the base of this. And then you also have to, the person that's going to do the convincing is going to be not the person who should have the strongest influence, but the person who does in fact have the strongest influence. And I know that from my own clinical experience, that a lot of times parents think that what they say should go, but there's often other members of the family who have a lot more influence.
Wendy mentioned earlier the fight or flight response. And I think that we inadvertently create that situation in our confrontation of people we disagree with. And it backs people up. If they feel attacked, then they're either going to fight or push back and become retrenched in their opinions, or flee, or sort of stop the conversation. So and then it creates a cycle, and then we get into our fight or flight because we're so annoyed, and then there's no more relationship and no more communication. So I think it's it's just so hard but so important not to go down that road, and realize that someone's going to have to break that cycle, even if it means not always sharing your opinion or being confrontational about it.
It's interesting that sort of brings us kind of full circle to something that the two of you emphasized a year ago, when again, over a year ago, 14 months ago, when the two of you held a similar session for our benefit, and where you talked about the thing that really has to remain is, at the end of the day, is relationship. And that was, I think, some of your parting comment, or toward the end last year when we discussed this.
But we're consistent, so that's good.
Yeah, still true, still true.
Is that done? Other comments or questions? Well, again, I thank the two of you, Jeff and Maurice, for coming out, as it were,